the Community Television Network.
Today on Discover USM, the University of Maine School of Law welcomes you to the second Frank M. Coffin Lecture on Law and Public Service. Professor Arthur M. Schlesinger, Jr. delivers his lecture on Multiculturalism and the Bill of Rights. Arthur M. Schlesinger, Jr., Pulitzer Prize-winning author, historian, teacher, and presidential advisor, is the second Frank M. Coffin Lecturer on Law and Public Service. Author of more than 20 volumes on American history and politics, Schlesinger received a Pulitzer Prize for History in 1946 for The Age of Jackson, and for biography in 1966 for 1,000 Days. His most recent book, The Disuniting of America, published in 1991, explores the impact of what he calls the ethnic upsurge on American society. Schlesinger, a history professor at Harvard University from 1946 to 1960, has been Albert Schweitzer Professor of Humanities at the City University of New York for 27 years. From 1961 to 1963, he served as special assistant to President John F. Kennedy. He also worked on the presidential campaigns of Adlai Stevenson, Robert Kennedy, and Ted Kennedy. First, greetings from Donald N. Zillman, Dean of the University of Maine School of Law.
Thank you and good evening. In 1865, the eminent American historian Francis Parkman, in the introduction to Pioneers of France in the New World, wrote, "Faithfulness to the truth of history involves far more than a research, however patient and scrupulous, into special facts. Such facts may be detailed with the most minute exactness, and yet the narrative taken as a whole may be unmeaning or untrue. The narrator must seek to imbue himself with the life and spirit of the time. He must study events in their bearings near and remote, in the character, habits, and manners of those who took part in them. He must himself be, as it were, a sharer or a spectator of the action he describes." What a fitting introduction for another eminent historian, this one of the 20th century, with ties to New England, our distinguished guest for the second Frank Coffin Lecture on Law and Public Service, Professor Arthur Schlesinger. On behalf of the Law School, the University of Southern Maine community, and the Portland community, I am delighted to welcome Professor Schlesinger to join us tonight. 1 year ago, we launched the Coffin Lectures in this facility. The air was electric. Triumph and tragedy intermingled. The tragedy, of course, was the unexpected death of Joe Rao less than a month before he was expected to deliver the first Frank Coffin Lecture. Triumph appeared in the presence of Ole and Michael Rao and Justice William Brennan and Mary Brennan. Their determination to formally deliver the paper that Joe had just completed days before his death made the evening a memorable one indeed. The subsequent publication of the paper in the pages of the Maine Law Review helped further the goal of the Coffin Lecture series, the discussion of crucial issues of law and public service. Public service is a part and an object of every law school. It is a special responsibility of the University of Maine School of Law, the one public law school and the single law school in the state of Maine. Public service challenges faculty, staff, and students. We seek to meet the challenge, succeeding we hope, failing on occasion we fear, in the operation of the region's largest public law library, in the client service of the Cumberland Legal Aid Clinic to low-income Mainers, in the contributions of faculty to state government in the workings of the bar, and in 30 years of training future governors, legislators, judges, prosecutors, defenders, and public administrators in the state of Maine and elsewhere. We are delighted to add the Coffin Lectureship to that list. Public service and the Honorable Frank M. Coffin are synonymous in this state. Judge Coffin's contribution to Maine, the nations, are now in their 5th decade. One might borrow from the national pastime and say that Frank Coffin is the Nolan Ryan of the federal bench. But testimony from lawyers, law clerks, litigants, his fellow judges, all indicate that Frank Coffin still has his high hard one, varied by some wonderful breaking stuff. His clerks swear that, if anything, his velocity has increased in recent years. More accurate, then, to honor Nolan Ryan as the Frank Coffin of organized baseball. Judge Coffin, may I ask you to introduce our speaker for this evening?
After that introduction, you may ask me, but I may not accept. So, Dean Zillman, President Patnode, Chief Justice Wathen, and all of our friends in this audience. This occasion is one which, to me, summons up what I call Rayburn's Law. When I was in the Congress, Speaker Rayburn was firmly wedded to the principle that the more celebrated the visitor to a joint session of House and Senate, the less of an introduction he needed. And hence, from that time on, we have had the introduction to the President, meaning it is my high honor and deep privilege to introduce the President. But Sam Rayburn still required some introduction. When President Roosevelt died and Harry Truman succeeded to the office, he came in to make his first appearance to a joint session of the Congress. And of course, gathered there were his friends and colleagues from decades of public service in the Capitol. And so the President started right in. Whereupon the Speaker, in a voice that could be heard, some say as far as his home in Bonham, Texas, said, "Slow up, Harry, I've got to introduce you." So, Arthur, wait a minute. I begin with a personal note. It is entirely appropriate that this lecture should bring our speaker to Portland and that I should introduce him. For it was a Portlander who brought us together nearly 40 years ago, the late Elizabeth Donahue, daughter of Helen Donahue, postmistress, friend of Eleanor Roosevelt, and owner of the Lafayette Hotel. Libby and Arthur had worked valiantly for Adlai Stevenson in his 1956 quest for the presidency. After I had been elected to Congress in the same year, she became my legislative assistant. For the rest of her life, she would visit Arthur and tell him about me and return to our home to regale us about Arthur. We didn't need a postman. She performed the same role as mediator of friendship for me and for last year's lecturer in absentia, Joe Rao. So I have a feeling Libby would highly approve these proceedings. When we first asked Professor Schlesinger to consider giving this lecture, his perceptive comment was, "But I'm a historian, not a lawyer." My rejoinder is that it is most fitting that early on in this series we should hear from such a person as the occupant of the Albert Schweitzer Chair in the Humanities of the City University of New York, particularly this occupant. For the theme of law and public service is in its essence a broad concept. It reaches beyond law for law's sake to the uses of law for the larger good. Lawyers practice their profession within the societal framework that surrounds them, and the extent of their contribution to that larger world will depend in no small part upon their grasp of where society has come from, where it is now, and where it is heading. At its noblest, the law is a humane profession, and its study within the generous precincts of the humanities. I do not propose to give a complete or even balanced curriculum vitae of our speaker. Were I to do justice to the academic and governmental positions held, the history and biography awards received, the 24 books written, the op-ed pieces fired off by this teacher, historian, biographer, essayist, polemicist, and presidential advisor, there would be no time left. What I do want to do is to say briefly why we await his thoughts eagerly. In other words, the special appropriateness of his addressing this audience tonight. To begin, I refer to a comment by a British historian, Sir Geoffrey Elton, who is bothered by the assumption of some of his fellows that work of real intellectual quality cannot coexist with clear and non-technical expression. His judgment: history, even serious history, is interesting, and the historian who makes it dull deserves the pillory. Well, our speaker, to my knowledge, has never written a dull sentence. This does not mean that he is glib or superficial. His very early The Age of Jackson, written in his late 20s, his monumental series on the age of Roosevelt, the position he holds as president of the Society of American Historians, attest to his scholarly status. But beyond looking at the past, Arthur Schlesinger has always been thoroughly immersed in the present. One need only list such works as The Vital Center, The Politics of Hope, 1,000 Days, JFK in the White House, The Bitter Heritage, Vietnam and American Democracy, The Crisis of Confidence, The Imperial Presidency, The Cycles of American History. Indeed, one might say that over the past 5 decades, no one has more faithfully recorded the temperature of our times. But our speaker has gone farther. He has not shrunk from looking at the future, even though until the future happens, predicting it necessarily involves controversy. Professor Schlesinger has somehow been able to use controversy constructively, testing and perfecting his ideas. In August of 1966, Arthur wrote to me from the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton just 1 month before leaving for the City University of New York. Even at that fairly early time, he was concerned about Vietnam, where, to use his words, "I fear that the course on which we have evidently embarked of widening the war is filled with wholly gratuitous peril and won't win the war either." A prescient comment. Also very good prose for just a private letter to a friend. Tonight, similarly, following on the heels of his latest book, The Disuniting of America, he looks ahead as he leads us into a contemporary field of discussion and action, part of an ongoing inquiry into what kind of a nation we have been, are, and should be. Finally, most relevant to the spirit that brings us together is the passion and commitment our speaker has brought to all phases of his life and work. A year ago, his 75th birthday was the occasion for a gathering of friends who honored him by helping raise funds for both the Roosevelt and the Kennedy libraries. He responded in part by saying, "What have I learned in these turbulent years? Not much, certainly not enough, but at least I hope a certain serenity produced by the cooling perspectives of history, along with a recognition of the need to mingle commitment with skepticism and crusading with jokes, and yet never to let irony sever the nerve of action. Ladies and gentlemen, Arthur Schlesinger.
Grateful to Judge Coffin for that generous and polished introduction. It is a high honor indeed to be invited to deliver the second Frank Coffin Lecture on Law and Public Service, all the more so because I follow in the footsteps of the two Americans who have done most in our lifetime to sustain the Bill of Rights, the brave and wise Justice William Brennan and that great-hearted advocate of individual freedom who died just about a year ago, Joe Rao. It is a high honor, but it is also a considerable intimidation. Who can possibly meet the standards so recklessly set in the first Frank Coffin Lecture? Moreover, I'm not a lawyer, as Frank reminded you, and before this audience especially, I must plead forbearance for the simplicities and solecisms to come. Historians have their uses, but most of my profession drift helplessly when plunged into the Sargasso Sea of legal technicality. Still, I am comforted by the thought that this lecture is in the name of Frank Coffin, who is one of the most humane and tolerant, as well as one of the most sagacious men I've ever known. Frank and I, as he remarked, go back a long way together. We first met nearly 40 years ago when Democrats were a beleaguered minority down east, and Frank and Ed Muskie reinvented the main party. I knew him when he served so ably in the House of Representatives, and we worked together in those exhilarating years when John Kennedy was President of the Republic. In the time since, I've watched his distinguished career on the bench with the greatest admiration. His book, The Ways of a Judge, seems to me the most subtle, just, and illuminating exercise in judicial self-analysis since the great Cardozo's The Nature of the Judicial Process. I'm glad to report, I put in an early plug, that Frank Coffin's fine new book, On Appeal, will be published early next year. As a judge, Frank Coffin has been notable for his understanding of the impact on public law of pressures of social change, especially as he has written, the pressures of limits to resources, limits to energy, space, privilege, opportunity, wealth, travel, education, and many other necessities and amenities to which we are only now being introduced after 2 centuries of faith in infinite growth, resources, and opportunities. This is much the situation foreseen a century ago by Woodrow Wilson. America, Wilson wrote in 1889 in a review of Bryce's American Commonwealth, America is now sauntering through her resources and through the mazes of her politics with easy nonchalance. But presently, there will come a time when she will be surprised to find herself grown old, a country crowded, strained, perplexed, when she will be obliged to pull herself together, adopt a new regimen of life, husband her resources, concentrate her strength, steady her methods, sober her views, restrict her vagaries, trust her best, not her average members. That, Wilson said, will be the time of change. Wilson's time of change is rushing upon us, and Frank Coffin has observed of judges in the maelstrom of change, their most elusive mission is that of safeguarding individual rights in a majoritarian society with due regard to the legitimate interests of that society. A quest, he adds, that if pursued broadly and sensitively by the citizens, in addition to judges, can go far toward making tolerable the coiled spring tension under which we have been chartered to live. Of the many changes that have overtaken America since Frank Coffin and I were young, One of the most striking is summed up in that relatively new word, multiculturalism. In a way, it is odd that the concept should be so new, since the United States has been from birth a multi-ethnic society, but through most of the history of the Republic, multiculturalism has been seen as a stage in the absorption of newcomers into a common American culture. In recent years, however, multiculturalism has developed an ideology and mystique of its own. In its militant form, it becomes a challenge to, even a holdout against, the historic process of absorption. It is in this sense that the word has suddenly invaded everyone's radar screen, that has excited such spirited, often angry debate, and that it argues today for a reinterpretation and decurtailment of our Bill of Rights. First point I would make about this multicultural debate is that multiculturalism is by no means a uniquely American issue. To understand its full significance, we must think about multiculturalism against the global backdrop and in terms of the transition the whole world is making from one grand historical epoch to the next. 20th century may well appear in retrospect as an era defined above all by the warfare of ideologies. It was a time when the liberal democratic idea was under siege by two mortal foes, the challenge of fascism in the first half of the century, the challenge of communism in the second. Democratic society finally succeeded in defeating both totalitarian creeds, fascism perishing with a bang, communism with a whimper. But the fading away of the ideological conflict does not mean, as some sages have optimistically forecast, the end of history. One set of hatreds replaces another, lifting the iron lid of ideological repression in Eastern Europe and what used to be the Soviet Union, releases pent-up ethnic, national, religious, linguistic antagonisms deeply rooted in history and in memory. The evaporation of the Cold War removes superpower restraints on national and tribal conflicts in the Third World. As the warfare of ideology subsides, the world thus enters, or more precisely re-enters, a possibly more dangerous era of ethnic and racial warfare. If the 20th century was a century of the warfare of ideologies, the 21st century promises to begin as a century of the warfare of ethnicities, and this, it should be noted, is a much older, profounder, and more unyielding form of warfare, one whose roots go back forever in time. As Klaus Kinkel, the German foreign minister, recently said, as if buried beneath a sheet of ice, ethnic conflicts were in a state of suspended animation under communist rule. Now that the sheet has been cracked, these conflicts are surfacing violently. The tragedy of Yugoslavia is only the most murderous portent of a darkening future. Yugoslav political scientist Simon Petrovic put it well the other day. Minorities, he said, are going to be an acid test for all post-communist societies. With communism all but disappearing, tribal instincts are coming back. And the hostility of one tribe for another is among the most ancient and most instinctive human reactions. Yet the history of our planet has been in great part the history of the mixing of peoples, and more so perhaps today than ever before. Today, as our 20th century staggers to a close, a number of factors, not alone the evaporation of the Cold War, but more enduringly the development of swifter modes of communication and transport, population growth, a breakdown of traditional social structures, the flight from chaos, from tyranny, from poverty, from ecological disaster, the dream of a better life somewhere else, all these factors drive people in mass migrations across national frontiers. And what happens when people of different ethnic origins, speaking different languages, professing different religions, settle in the same geographical locality and live under the same political sovereignty? Unless a common purpose binds them together, tribal resentments and enmities will drive them apart. No one in the 19th century thought more carefully about the problems of representative government than John Stuart Mill. The two elements that defined nationality, as Mill saw it, were the desire to be governed together and what he called the common sympathy created by shared history, values, and language. Mill wrote, "Free institutions are next to impossible in a country made up of different nationalities. Among a people without fellow feeling, especially if they read and speak different languages, the united public opinion necessary to the working of representative government cannot exist. It is in general a necessary condition of free institutions," John Stuart Mill said, "that the boundaries of government should coincide in the main with those of nationalities." What happens when those boundaries fail to coincide? Nationhood at best is difficult both to achieve and to sustain. Events every day demonstrate the fragility of national cohesion. Ethnic and racial warfare, it seems evident, is replacing the warfare of ideologies as the explosive issue of our times. On every side today, ethnicity is the cause of the breaking of nations. The ex-Soviet Union, the ex-Yugoslavia, India, Lebanon, South Africa, Ireland are all in ethnic, racial, or religious turmoil. Crises of one form or another of ethnic cleansing disturb and divide Sri Lanka, Burma, Indonesia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Israel, Turkey, Ethiopia, Somalia, Nigeria, Liberia, Angola, Sudan, Zaire, Guyana, Trinidad, you name it. Even nations as stable and civilized as Britain, France, and Germany, Belgium, Spain, and Austria face growing ethnic and racial troubles. As the British magazine The Economist said the other day, the virus of tribalism risks becoming the AIDS of international politics, lying dormant for years, then flaring up to destroy countries. Take the case of our neighbor to the north. Canada has long been considered the most sensible and sedate of nations, rich, peaceful, by the standards of almost anywhere else, enviably successful, yet Canada today is on the brink of bust-up. As one Canadian recently wrote, "Here we have one of the 5 richest nations on earth, a country so uniquely blessed with space and opportunity that the world's poor are beating at the door to get in, and it is tearing itself apart. If one of the top 5 developed nations on earth can't make a federal multi-ethnic state work," this writer asks, "who else can?" The answer to that increasingly urgent question has been the United States. Now, how have Americans succeeded in pulling off this almost unprecedented trick of making a federal multi-ethnic state work? Other countries break up because they fail to give ethnically diverse peoples compelling reasons to see themselves as part of the same nation. The United States has thus far, more or less, offered such reasons. What is it then, in the absence of a common ethnic origin, that has bound Americans together over 2 turbulent centuries? For America, as noted, it's been a multi-ethnic country from the start. Hector St. Jean de Crèvecoeur emigrated from France to the American colonies in 1759, married an American woman, settled in a farm in Orange County, New York, and published his Letters from an American Farmer during the American Revolution. This 18th century French American marveled at the astonishing diversity of the other settlers, a mixture, he wrote, of English, Scotch, Irish, French, Dutch, Germans, and Swedes, a strange mixture of blood, he said, that you could find in no other country. And from this promiscuous breed, Crèvecoeur wrote, that race now called Americans have arisen. The word race, as used in the 18th century, means what we mean by nationality today. Thus people spoke of the English race, the German race, and so on. And what Crèvecoeur mused were the characteristics of this newly emergent American race. In the Letters from an American Farmer, he propounded a famous question, what then is the American, this new man? 20th century must overlook 18th century male obliviousness to the existence of women. Crèvecoeur gave his own question its classic answer. He is an American who, leaving behind him all his ancient prejudices and manners, receives new ones. From the new mode of life he has embraced, the new government he obeys, and the new rank he holds. The American is a new man who acts upon new principles. Here, Krevker said, here individuals of all nations are melded into a new race of men. A pluribus unum, one out of many. The United States had this brilliant solution for the inherent fragility, the inherent combustibility of a multi-ethnic society, and that was the creation of a brand new national identity by individuals who, in forsaking old loyalties and joining to make new lives, melded away past ethnic differences, a national identity that absorbs and transcends the diverse ethnicities that come to these shores, ethnicities that enrich and reshape the common culture in the very act of entering into it. Those intrepid Europeans who had torn up their roots to brave the wild Atlantic wanted to forget a horrid past and to embrace a hopeful future. Their goals were escape, deliverance, assimilation. They saw America as a transforming nation, banishing dismal memories and developing a unique national character based not on common ethnic origins, but on common political ideals and experiences. The point of America was not to preserve old cultures, but to establish a new American culture. Americans have never, at least until very recently, much believed in ancestor worship. From the Revolution on, Americans have had a vigorous sense of national identity, forged in the War for Independence, articulated in the Declaration of 76 and the Constitution of 87, deepened by the subsequent experience of self-government. George Washington affirmed the national creed when he invited those he called the oppressed and persecuted of all nations and religions, invited them to come to America, but not, he said, in clannish groups sticking to themselves, rather to come as individuals prepared, in his words, for intermixture with our people, so that they could be assimilated to our customs, measures, and laws, in a word, soon become one people. John Quincy Adams, as Secretary of State, advised prospective immigrants to cast off their European skin, never to resume it. They must look forward to their posterity rather than backward to their ancestors. America had its own identity derived from its own experience and its own ideals. From the start, citizenship was defined not by bloodlines, but by political principle, not by jus sanguinis, but by an adaptation of jus soli. When Alexis de Tocqueville came to America half a century after the adoption of the Constitution, he wondered how this miscellaneous American society, formed, he wrote, of all the nations of the world, people having different languages, beliefs, opinions, in a word, a society without roots, without memories, how such a miscellaneous society could turn into a single nation. The answer, Tocqueville decided, was that nations could be based on adherence to an idea. The American secret, he concluded, was the national commitment embodied in the Constitution to democracy, self-government, individual freedom, and equality before the law. It was this common purpose that would enable Americans to forge a single culture and a single nation from people of bewilderingly diverse racial, religious, ethnic, and linguistic origins. The rights of citizenship, the experience of political participation, the development of a civic culture, these would dissolve differences and become the great national unifier. Now, national unification in America had its brutal limits, as we shall soon note. Yet half a century after Tocqueville, another great foreign observer of the American Commonwealth, the Britisher James Bryce, was similarly struck by what he called the amazing solvent power which American institutions, habits, and ideas exercise upon newcomers, quickly dissolving and assimilating the foreign bodies that are poured into her mass. Half a century after Bryce, a third perceptive foreign observer, Gunnar Myrdal of Sweden, in his great study of race relations and American dilemma, found the essence of Bryce's solvent power in what he called the American creed, and showed why that creed held out hope even for those most cruelly excluded by the dominant white majority. The creed as the spur forever goading white Americans to live up to their proclaimed principles. This vigorous sense of national identity accounts for America's relative success in converting Crèvecoeur's promiscuous breed into George Washington's one people. The power of the civic culture as an agency of assimilation has enabled the mixture of peoples in the United States to coalesce into a single nation. This is not to say that the United States has lived up to its own best ideals. New waves of immigration brought in peoples who fitted awkwardly into a society that was inescapably English in language, ideas, and institutions. For a long time, Anglo-Americans dominated American culture and American politics. The melding process described by Crèvecoeur did not easily melt immigrants from Ireland, from Germany, even less so for Southern and Eastern Europe. Still, even those snubbed and spurned by the Anglo-Americans were enabled by the exercise of democratic rights to enter into, join, and remold the American culture. As for the non-white peoples, those already in America whom the European newcomers overran and massacred, or those others hauled in against their will from Africa and Asia, deeply bred racism put them all, red Americans, black Americans, yellow Americans, brown Americans, well outside the pale. We must face the shameful fact, historically, America has been a racist nation. After all, white Americans started out as a people so confident in our own racial superiority that we felt licensed to kill red people, to enslave black people, and to import yellow and brown people for peon labor. We white Americans have been racist in our laws, in our institutions, in our customs, in our conditioned reflexes, in our souls. The curse of racism has been the great failure of the American experiment, the glaring contradiction of American ideals, and the still crippling disease of American life. Yet even non-white Americans, miserably treated as they have been, have contributed to the formation of the national identity. They became members, if third-class members of American society, and helped give the common culture new form and flavor. Like white Americans, black Americans did not cling to their past, but rather helped change the present and the future. The infusion of non-Anglo stocks steadily reconfigured the British legacy and made the United States, as we all know, a very different country today from Britain. This vision of America as a new national identity, superseding, absorbing, and modified by the diverse ethnicities of those who came here, that vision prevailed through most of the 2 centuries of the history of the United States. But the 20th century has brought forth a new and opposing vision in a nation marked by an even stranger mixture of blood than Crèvecoeur had known. His question, what then is the American, this new man, is asked once more with new intensity and with a new answer. Today, many Americans disavow the historic goal of a new race of man. The escape from origins has given way to the search for roots. A cult of ethnicity has arisen. It began among non-Anglo white minorities. Remember Michael Novak in his book of 1971, The Rise of the Unmeltable Ethnics. Novak writing, the new ethnic politics is a direct challenge to the WASP conception of America. It asserts that groups can structure the rules and goals and procedures of American life. And this view that groups rather than individuals were the essence of America was soon taken up by non-white minorities, all joining to denounce the ideas of assimilation, integration, the melting pot, and to protect, promote, and perpetuate separate ethnic and racial communities. Thus arises the multicultural challenge to the traditional concept of American nationhood. This eruption of ethnicity has had some very good consequences. It has forced the American culture at last to reflect on the inexcusable persistence of group inequalities and to give shamefully overdue recognition to the achievements of minorities subordinated and ignored during the high noon of Anglo dominance. American education has begun at last to acknowledge the existence and the significance of the great swirling world beyond Europe. All this is to the good. But pressed too far, the cult of ethnicity has, in my view, disturbing consequences too. The new ethnic gospel in its militant form rejects the unifying concept of a unique American identity. It rejects the vision of individuals from all nations melded into a new race. It rejects the ideals of assimilation and integration. It rejects the common culture. Its underlying philosophy is that America is not a nation of individuals at all, but a nation of groups, that ethnicity is the defining experience for Americans, that ethnic ties are permanent and indelible, that Americans must be primarily classified according to ethnic and racial criteria, and the division into ethnic communities establishes the basic structure of American society and the basic meaning of American history. While the ethnic interpretation of American history, like the economic interpretation, is valid and illuminating up to a point, it is fatally misleading, I believe, when presented as the whole picture. The ethnic interpretation, moreover, reverses the historic theory of America, the theory of America as one people, the theory that has thus far, in a world of mounting ethnic conflict, managed to keep American society whole. Instead of a transformative nation with an identity all its own, America in this new revelation is seen as preservative of diverse alien identities. Instead of a nation composed of individuals making their own unhampered choices, America is seen as a collection of ethnic and racial tribes, each more or less ineradicable in its commitment and its loyalties. This latter-day exaltation of ethnic and racial separatism repudiates historic purposes, replacing assimilation by fragmentation, integration by apartheid, a single nation founded on an idea by a multiple nation founded on ethnic communities. It reverses the national motto, making it a unum pluribus, many out of one. The idea of a unifying American identity is now in trouble in many arenas, in our politics, our voluntary organizations, our churches, our entertainment, our language. And in no arena, perhaps, is the movement to do away with the conception of an overriding national identity more crucial than in our system of education. For our public schools have historically been the great agency of assimilation, the great means of transforming newcomers into Americans. As Woodrow Wilson put it 80 years ago, the great melting pot of America, the place where we are all made Americans, is the public school, where men of every race and of every origin and of every station in life send their children, or ought to send their children, Wilson said, and where, being mixed together, the youngsters are all infused with the American spirit and developed into American men and American women. What students are taught in school affects the way they will thereafter see and treat other Americans, whether they see them as fellow citizens of the same country or as members of an alien group. The debate about the curriculum, in a way, is a debate about what it means to be an American. What then about multicultural education? It all depends on how you define it. When multicultural education means teaching our kids about other continents, other cultures, other races, other creeds, I'm all for it. When it means in teaching American history, for example, giving due and belated credit to the achievement of groups too long neglected in traditional accounts, women, blacks, Asian Americans, Latinos, this is plainly a great step forward. When it means teaching history from a variety of perspectives, seeing the arrival of Columbus, for example, from the viewpoint of those who met him as well as from the viewpoint of those who sent him, this too is a great advance. But when multicultural education means that our schools should teach subjects like history in order to make kids feel good about their particular ancestors and thereby allegedly promote self-esteem, when it gives groups veto power over their ways their particular histories are written and taught, when it calls upon public schools to celebrate, reinforce, and harden ethnic loyalties and to promote separate communities, that is a very different matter. Multicultural education in this celebratory sense begins in ethnic breastfeeding and cheerleading and ends in fragmentation, separation, segregation, ghettoization. It means a denial of the common culture in favor of a collection of tribal subcultures. The American Republic, let us never forget, was conceived as a nation of individuals. As President Wilson once told an audience of new citizens, you cannot become a thorough American if you think of yourselves in groups. America does not consist of groups. A man who thinks of himself as belonging to a particular national group in America has not yet become an American. And when multiculturalism means the running down, the systematic disparagement of Western history and values, it weakens, I think, the foundations of the liberal democratic way of life. Multicultural zealots denounce the Eurocentric curriculum, oppose the study of Western civilization, and present Europe as a source of imperialism, racism, sexism, patriarchalism, indeed as the root of all evil. Well, the crimes of Europe are famous. Crimes against lesser breeds without the law, not to mention even worse crimes, Hitlerism and Stalinism against other Europeans. But these crimes cannot alter other facts of history. Europe was the birthplace of the United States of America. The European ideas and culture formed the Republic, that the United States is an extension of European civilization, and that more than 3/4 of all Americans are of European descent. It may be lamentable that dead white males of European extraction have played so large a part in shaping our history, but that's the way it was. To pretend otherwise would be to falsify history. And while Europe, like every other culture, has committed its share of crimes, unlike other cultures, it has originated and acted upon ideals that expose and combat its own crimes. No other culture has built self-criticism into the very fabric of its being. The crimes of the West in time generated their own antidotes, provoking the great movements to end slavery. Slavery was abolished in Africa by Europeans, not by Africans. To raise the status of women, so deplorable in most non-European countries. To abolish torture, to combat racism, to promote religious tolerance, to defend freedom of inquiry, to enlarge personal liberty, to protect and promote human rights. Whatever the particular crimes of Europe, that continent is also the source, the unique source of those liberating ideals of individual liberty, political democracy, national independence, equality before the law, freedom of worship, women's rights, and so on, to which most of the world today aspires. These are ideals that empower people of every continent, color, and creed, and they are European ideals. In Moscow today, they're studying the Federalist Papers, and the students in revolt at Tiananmen Square raised up a replica of the Statue of Liberty. Radical multiculturalists argue that the Western tradition has nothing to say to non-white minorities. What argument could be better calculated to disable minorities in a democratic society? As a Palestinian American, Professor Edward Said reminds us, great anti-authoritarian uprisings made their earliest advances not by denying the humanitarian and universalist claims of the general dominant culture, but by attacking the adherents of that culture for failing to extend those standards to all, as opposed to a small fraction of humanity. Thus, despite Professor Said, multicultural ideologues reject the Western democratic tradition, as well as the historic identification of America as a common culture, and they have also turned against the modern American reading of the Bill of Rights. That reading, I need not remind this audience, took time to evolve. The Founding Fathers had a more restricted view of the Bill of Rights than we have today. They did not believe, for example, that the First Amendment outlawed prosecutions for seditious libel or for blasphemy. The sainted Jefferson himself, exasperated by belligerent Federalist editors, wrote to the governor of Pennsylvania, "I have long thought that a few prosecutions of the most prominent offenders would have a wholesome effect." So much for the free press. But the ratification of the 14th Amendment and the subsequent exercises in judicial incorporation created our modern idea of civil liberties and our modern understanding of the First Amendment. That idea, the modern idea of civil liberties, can be summed up in a few familiar phrases uttered initially by justices in dissent, but eventually pronounced by court majorities, the law of the land. However familiar these phrases may be, they bear repetition. The question in every case, said Justice Holmes, is whether the words are used in such circumstances and are of such a nature as to create a clear and present danger that they will bring about the substantive evils that Congress has a right to prevent. No danger flowing from speech, said Justice Brandeis, can be deemed clear and present unless the incidence of the evil apprehended is so imminent that it may befall before there is opportunity for full discussion. If there be time to expose through discussion the falsehood and fallacies, to avert the evil by processes of education, the remedy to be applied is more speech, not enforced silence. Freedom, Justice Holmes emphasized, means not just free thought for those who agree with us, what great virtue resides in that, but freedom for the thought that we hate. Freedom for the thought that we hate. This is a proposition that now falls under attack from a multicultural perspective. Through most of the century, the thought that we hated had been totalitarian political thought, fascism, Nazism, communism. That was, of course, the age of the warfare of ideologies. And under pressure of hot war and then of Cold War, the Supreme Court did give ground from time to time in construing First Amendment protection of hateful political utterance. But in the main, the Bill of Rights survived hot and cold wars intact. Thus, in the midst of the Second World War, at a time of the highest patriotic fervor, with the life of the nation truly at risk, the court threw out, as a violation of the First Amendment, the West Virginia statute requiring school children to salute and pledge allegiance to the American flag. If there be any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, wrote Justice Jackson, it is that no official, high or petty, can prescribe what is orthodox in politics, nationalism, religion, or other matters of opinion. This decision against flag salutes and the Pledge of Allegiance, against compulsory flag salutes and compulsory pledges of allegiance, this decision was handed down when young Americans were fighting and dying on many fronts. But the American people in 1943, far from denouncing the court, applauded the decision as a pretty good statement of what we were fighting for. In the later years of the Cold War, the court in Brandenburg versus Ohio, 1969, reaffirmed and reformulated Holmes's clear and present danger test. In the Skokie case in 1978, the court upheld the right of neo-Nazis to march down the streets of an Illinois town inhabited by Holocaust survivors and their families. Hurt feelings were not considered enough to justify reduction of constitutional protection. As Justice Brennan wrote in Texas versus Johnson, the flag-burning case in 1989, if there is a bedrock principle underlying the First Amendment, it is that the government may not prohibit the expression of an idea simply because society finds the idea itself offensive or disagreeable. In asserting libertarian principles, the court in nearly all these cases was repelling attacks from the right. The conservatives and the hyper-patriots were in those days the militant champions of repression and censorship. But in a bizarre switch of roles, the demand to suppress hate speech comes these days from the left. Even more ironically, that demand is centered in our colleges and universities, exactly the places, above all others, where unlimited freedom of expression had previously been deemed sacred. And those who lead the assault on the Holmes, Brandeis, Jackson, Brennan conception of the Bill of Rights do so in the name of defending and nourishing the multicultural society. As Henry Louis Gates, Jr., the W.E.B. Du Bois Professor of the Humanities at Harvard, a leading black intellectual, as Professor Gates has recently written, civil liberties are regarded by many as a chief obstacle to civil rights. The byword among many black activists and black intellectuals is no longer the political imperative to protect free speech, it is the moral imperative to suppress hate speech. The very phrase hate speech is new. It does not appear as a concept or even as an index entry in Leonard Levy's invaluable 4-volume Encyclopedia of the American Constitution, published only 7 years ago. And let us not dismiss the case for suppression too quickly. As the warfare of ideologies emphasized for many the vulnerability of free society in the face of fascist and communist propaganda, led to demand that society protect itself by suppression, so the warfare of ethnicities emphasizes the vulnerability of free society in the face of racist propaganda and leads to compro demands for self-protection. Democratic governments with memories of the Holocaust and apprehensions about growing ethnic hostilities are naturally and honorably concerned to arrest the spread of tribal and racial hatreds. The United Nations has been in the forefront of the drive to declare, and I quote from the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, as adopted in 1966. This convention declares all dissemination of ideas based on racial superiority and hatred they're to be punished as an offense. They're declared to be an offense punishable by law, the dissemination of ideas. The United States has signed this document, but the Senate has thus far refused to ratify it on the ground of its incompatibility with the First Amendment. One can easily understand why Germany, in the light of its own past, would ban neo-Nazi groups as a clear and present danger to society. But Western democracies with secure democratic traditions have passed laws punishing, to use the language of the British Racial Relations Act of 1965, punishing the circulation of materials aimed at fomenting hatred against any section of the public in Great Britain, distinguished by color, race, ethnic, or national origins, including the use of threatening, abusive, or insulting words. Section 319 of Canada's Criminal Code is similarly designed to combat the propagation of hate against racial and religious minorities. The adoption of such laws in other democracies strengthens the case of those who would censor hate speech in the United States. Nor is there any mystery why the agitation for such censorship finds a special location in our universities. The problem of hate speech acquires peculiar poignancy in educational settings. It is no fun running a university in these days. White students can often be cruel in their exclusion of minorities, their wanton harassment, their heavy-handed pranks, their vile and wounding cracks and taunts. Minority students, for the most understandable reasons, are often vulnerable and frightened. Racial jokes, slurs, epithets hurled by majority bullies pose difficult questions for educational administrators. Consider how a shy and scared black kid at the University of Michigan must have felt when posters appeared around the campus parodying the slogan of the United Negro College Fund, "A mind is a terrible thing to waste, especially on a nigger." After a while, administrators begin to ask themselves, which is more important, protecting hate speech or stopping racial persecution? Does not the tolerance of racism prevent minority students from joining the intellectual life of the university on equal terms? Should not the Bill of Rights protect equality as well as liberty? Does not hate speech destroy equality and thereby undermine the very premises of education? There's a certain sympathy for besieged administrators who, doing their best to keep the peace and give minority students an equal chance, impose regulations to restrict racist speech. More than 100 institutions, according to the American Civil Liberties Union, have speech codes. Some, like those adopted by the University of Michigan and the University of Wisconsin, have been invalidated by the courts as manifestly unconstitutional. Others, more narrowly drawn or existing in private institutions rather than public institutions, make ingenious claims to constitutionality, resting, as Cass Sunstein would have it, on a diminished distinction between words and acts, and an enhanced distinction between low-value and high-value speech, or on the proposition urged by many that constitutional guarantees of liberty and of equality are on a collision course, and liberty should not be furthered at the expense of equality. That is, the First Amendment right to speak should not be preferred to the 14th Amendment right to obtain an equal education. Or, in some cases, on an invocation of the fighting words doctrine in the 1942 case of Chaplinsky versus New Hampshire, though the court has subsequently found little sustenance in that doctrine insofar as it claims to be more than a restatement of clear and present danger. As a non-lawyer, I shall not be rash enough to pass on the constitutional merits of the various arguments for the abridgment of the First Amendment. As an historian, I may perhaps be permitted comment on the practical impact of racist speech and of anti-racist speech, anti-hate speech legislation, an impact that some hold sufficiently powerful to justify censorship, even if censorship of racist speech could well create precedents for future censorship of other sorts of speech. It is even suggested that creating such precedents would not matter, since free speech is of no particular help to minorities anyway. African Americans and other people of color, Professor Charles Lawrence of the Stanford Law School tells us, are skeptical about the argument that even the most injurious speech must remain unregulated, because in an unregulated marketplace of ideas, the best ones will rise to the top and gain acceptance. Experience, Professor Lawrence says, tells quite the opposite. People of color have seen too many demagogues elected by appealing to America's racism. One wonders where Professor Lawrence has been over the last half-century, for experience tells us, on the contrary, that in the unregulated marketplace of ideas, the idea of white supremacy has vanished, and the idea of racial equality has been accepted in principle, if not, alas, in practice. There are few stronger arguments for the unregulated marketplace of ideas and the fantastic shift of the half-century since Gunnar Myrdal wrote An American Dilemma. I have students read An American Dilemma, a superb book, but they are incredulous at the conditions that were described by Gunnar Myrdal half a century ago. When I was a young fellow, and Frank was young, senators and congressmen would orate on Capitol Hill about the virtue and necessity of white supremacy. But in the last 40 years, has anyone heard such an oration on Capitol Hill? I would never have believed it 50 years ago if someone had told me that within my lifetime, with black Americans only 12% of the population, a black general would be chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, black justices would sit on the Supreme Court, there would be a black governor of Virginia, black mayors in Atlanta, Birmingham, New Orleans, and other southern cities, as well as in New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, Detroit, Seattle. How has this come about? It has come about, as Skip Gates, Professor Gates, reminds us, it was precisely the First Amendment that licensed the protests, the rallies, the organization, and the agitation that galvanized the nation and made white America begin to live up to its own alleged principles. The struggle for racial justice is far from over. There are still miles to go before we sleep, but changes have been made. Would they have come faster if we had followed Professor Lawrence and prohibited racist speech? All that would have done is to convert the neo-Confederates into the great champions of the Bill of Rights. A more positive argument for censorship is that educational institutions must take a stand against bigotry. But surely there are many ways short of coercion that educational leadership can use to discourage and condemn bigotry. And censorship breeds its own evils. In some institutions, Radical professors and students lay down a party line, denounce deviationists as politically incorrect, and even drive them from the lecture platform. The rise of left-wing thought police reminds one of the right-wing students who in Joe McCarthy's days used to haunt the classrooms of liberal professors like me, hoping to catch and report whiffs of Marxism emanating from the podium. Of all institutions, universities should have the least truck with censorship. A stronger argument emphasizes the harm that uncensored speech is believed to do to defenseless individuals. Unquestionably, racial slurs and insults and taunts can be deeply injurious, but is the injury words inflict on sensibilities sufficiently weighty and enduring to justify so drastic a remedy as limitations on freedom of speech? Speech codes often carry the implication that insensitive speech should not be permitted. The notion that insensitivity, saying something that will hurt somebody's feelings, the notion that that is a terrible crime, may have dangerous consequences. If we start down that road, we will end up endorsing Ayatollah Khomeini and his crusade against the satanic verses. Does the fact that the satanic verses hurts the feelings of devout Muslims really justify the murder or the death sentence of Salman Rushdie? And how practically effective have those statutes been that are designed to stop the dissemination of racist ideas? Germany, because of its special experience, may well require special measures, but in neither Britain nor Canada has legislation diminished racism nor discouraged the merchants of hate. Indeed, both countries have recently seen a dismaying increase in racial incidents. Neither country demonstrates that censorship is more effective than free discussion in bringing about a tolerant and harmonious society. Driving thoughts underground may only cause them to explode later. When hate leads on to physical assault and violence, that is another matter and one requiring prompt and sharp counteraction. But there are plenty of statutes to deal with violent crime. Speech, however offensive, odious, repulsive, is not by itself a crime, nor historically has it been an instrument of oppression. Quite the contrary, free speech historically has been a means, one might say the means, of liberation. As Norman Corwin, whom the more venerable may remember as the author half a century ago of that once celebrated radio program on the Bill of Rights called "We Hold These Truths," as Norman Corwin puts it, the Bill of Rights doesn't offer freedom from speech. To silence an idea because it might offend a minority doesn't protect that minority. It deprives it of the tool it needs most, the right to talk back. The idea of bringing harmony to a multicultural society through censorship is, I think, an evasion of the real problem. Speech reflects social inequities and disparities. It does not cause them. If we are serious about bringing minorities into full membership in our society must provide jobs, schools, health care, and housing. It must provide equal opportunity in employment and education. The answer lies along these lines. It does not lie in the amputation of the Bill of Rights. And above all, the members of the white majority must open their minds and hearts. The burden to unify the country does not fall primarily on the minorities. Those who want to join America must be received and welcomed by those who think they own America. Assimilation and integration constitute a two-way street. Instead of slamming doors against minorities and burning crosses on their lawns, thereby driving them into defensive and defiant separatism, the majority must begin treating them as they would their own. American population is more heterogeneous than ever, but this very heterogeneity makes the quest for unifying ideals and a common culture all the more urgent. Racial harmony is not an impossible dream. America, as Scott Fitzgerald said, is a willingness of the heart. We have it within our power to make this a fair and a just society for all our people. May I recall some words of Mahatma Gandhi, words that used to be inscribed on public posters throughout India, a country far more fiercely divided than our own by ethnic and racial and religious and linguistic antagonisms. We must cease, Gandhi said, we must cease to be exclusive Hindus or Muslims or Sikhs, Parsis, Christians or Jews. Whilst we may staunchly adhere to our respective faiths, we must be Indians first and Indians last. It is because India has abandoned these teachings of Gandhi that it is so tragically divided today. But in the spirit of Gandhi, while we heterogeneous Americans may staunchly adhere to our diverse traditions, let us never forget that in the end we are members one of another, Americans first and Americans last. In a world savagely rent by ethnic and racial conflicts, it is all the more essential that the United States continue as an example of how a highly differentiated society preserves its liberties and holds itself together. Thank you.
Are open to your questions and comments. Could you come down to the microphone, please?
Professor Schlesinger, you say that your friendship with Judge Coffin goes back to 1952, when I was a student at Bates College, like Judge Coffin, and graduated in 1940. Sir, America has changed very much in the 40-year period, and I see in the daily newspapers a coarsening, a violence, a vulgarity, a downing in our culture. It would be easy to answer my question, which I now pose to you, by saying it has racist overtones. But that is not my intent. I grew up in Boston. I lived in New Haven. I see violence. I see a deterioration in the educational system. And I see that the prediction is that by the year 2050, only 53% of Americans will be white. I ask you, please, sir, to comment on what you see as a correlation between the continuing rise in the black Puerto Rican population of this country and the downgrading of our educational system and the appalling violence in our cities. Is this a good thing?
I rather doubt the demographic projection. Most demographic predictions turn out to be wrong. But I would say that what's happening from the point of view of a historian, many of the things you comment on and many people comment on with regard to the increase in black population or Puerto Rican. Actually, blacks are only 12% of the people in this country. The Hispanics are less than that. Asian Americans are about 5%. But if you read in the 19th century what was being said about the Irish in this country, you will find much the same things. The Irish were all regarded as poverty-stricken, as drunks, as pig farmers. Wherever they came, there was a spread of crime, there was a spread of violence, there was a spread of drunkenness. W.E.B. Du Bois, a black man, in his memoirs describes growing up in western Massachusetts. And he said there was race prejudice when I grew up in western Massachusetts. It was directed much more against the Irish than against me. I think that, and yet today the Irish, through education and hard work and so on, are respected citizens. And I think that these things, I think a large part of the trouble, as I suggested in my concluding remarks, is the extent to which white America has driven as the minorities. Minorities would like to join the mainstream. They would like to go to better schools. They would like to have better jobs. But they've been excluded because of a continuing racism on the part of white America. And I think that America is going to continue to be an English-speaking country. It's going to be a country that's going to be dedicated to democracy. And I think you're going to have more and more blacks on the model of Colin Powell. And I think that we ought to do everything we can to expedite that process by improving the schools, improving education, improving health care, and by giving non-white minorities a better chance in our life.
Last year, the Supreme Court in the RAV versus St. Paul case struck down a so-called hate crime statute, but then in its last term, the Supreme Court in a Wisconsin case upheld a crime which enhanced penalties for so-called hate-motivated crimes. Do you see this as a retreat from the sort of principles that you were citing, quoting earlier from Justices Holmes, Brandeis, Brennan, or do you think that the Supreme Court is indeed striking a balance that perhaps needs to be struck regarding the First Amendment?
The issue involved here is whether if a crime is committed and that crime can be shown to have had a racial motive, does that justify an enhanced punishment for the crime, as I understand it? And the argument against that is that just because a fellow, before he commits assault and battery, shouts, as in the Wisconsin case with black fellows beating up a white boy, I think, and that if he shouts, let's go beat up Whitey, and therefore putting on a racist basis, should he be punished more severely than if he just committed assault and battery for purposes of robbery or some other more legitimate motive? The argument against that is that's an argument that it's an abuse of free, that you are penalized for free speech, and free speech you're penalized for utterance, and since the evidence of racial motivation in an assault and battery case would be whatever the person said. I find, on the whole, I think I agree more with the second court decision, but I'm not altogether sure about it. I don't know whether it's proper to invite Judge Coffin to make some remarks. After all, it's his lecture. Do you have any views on this? He would prefer to abstain. Cases of this sort may arise before him. I'm marginally inclined to favor the belief that it does justify enhanced punishment. How do you feel?
I'm on the National Board of the ACLU, and I actually voted against the ACLU's filing an amicus brief in that case supporting the Wisconsin law. I don't think it's for the ACLU actually to be helping the Supreme Court find reasons to compromise the First Amendment. I think it is a close call, but I would call it differently than the Supreme Court did.
Professor Schlesinger, would you be willing to comment on the court ruling requiring your university to reinstate Professor Jeffries? Would you agree with that decision?
Leonard Jeffries is a professor at the, unquote, at the City College of New York, who's well known for his demagogic teachings. He was recently suspended as chairman of the African American Studies on the ground of a speech he gave in a public forum He then sued the City University of New York, won $400,000 in reinstatement. He is a man of no standing at all as a scholar. He's done no scholarly work since his PhD dissertation. He's well known for a number of crank theories, such as the Africans are sun people, and therefore benevolent and kindly, and the Europeans are ice people, and therefore cruel, cold, and warlike, and that the amount of melanin in the skin pigmentation determines whether you're a good guy or a bad guy, and other such theories that he teaches in his courses. I think the City University of New York made a great mistake in trying to suspend him, discipline him on the ground of a speech he gave in a public forum. I think a professor should be protected, and if he wants to give an idiotic speech, that's his business. On the other hand, I think the university would have had a very strong case against him on the grounds of what he taught in the classroom. That academic freedom does not permit the professor to instruct his students that 8 times 7 is 12. And when clearly demonstrable misstatements are made, and when the classroom is made a vehicle for propaganda, whether racist propaganda or political propaganda or whatever, and this is demonstrably a delinquency of professor of academic duty, this is not protected by academic freedom. The New York chapter of the ACLU made a clear statement to this effect with regard at the time of the Jeffries case. If the university had proceeded against Jeffries on the ground that, as I say, of his performance in the classroom, I think they would have succeeded. Unfortunately, the university administrators, out of white guilt or whatever, had not reproved Jeffries, had in fact sent him kind of routine letters saying what a great job he was doing. So they had no paper file on which to make a case, and they tried to do it on an irrelevant issue, which is what he said in a public forum, and they lost the case as predictably. They should have lost it.
We have time for 2 more in the public portion of the program. Yes, ma'am.
She was next.
Professor, you made the comment that speech has never been an instrument of oppression. However, the Congress has, through Title VII and Titles IX, prohibited acts, including speech, which create hostile and intimidating environments in the workplace under Title VII, and then under Title IX for educational institutions. Supreme Court cases have upheld speech codes, harassment rules in the workplace. There have been no Supreme Court cases dealing in higher ed. However, last year in Franklin v. Gwinnett, which dealt with a Title IX sexual harassment case, the Supreme Court made the statement that just as in the workplace, we do not allow a supervisor to have a sexual relationship with an underling, so equally must we apply the same standards in an educational institution. Do you think it's likely that a court might extend this then and say, just as we do not allow harassing racial or gender harassment in the workplace, so too can we not allow it in an educational institution, since Congress has mandated no hostile and intimidating environments?
You're quite right that the Civil Rights Act in those sections does prohibit that kind of verbal harassment in the workplace. I do not think that's likely to be extended to an educational institution, because the heart of an intellectual institution is a free exchange of ideas. That is not the heart of a workplace. So I think the 2 cases can be rather readily distinguished.
But is that not assuming that women and minorities have been allowed the privilege and been conditioned to exchange ideas verbally in the same way that the traditionally white male educated society has been? I think that was one of the reasons that these rules were enacted in the workplace and in institutions, because of the traditional less willingness or ability of women and minorities to confront on a verbal level the same way we may be less comfortable conducting ourselves on a physical level in conflict.
Well, I have more confidence in the capacity of women to take care of themselves, fortified in that by the splendid example shown by Hillary Rodham Clinton.
It's obvious as Americans that we live in a very diverse society. Do you ever think there'll be true harmony between all of us? Between all of us in a general sort of way?
Harmony. Will there be true harmony?
Will there
True
be?
harmony.
All races.
Will there be true harmony? Well, you know, only true harmony only comes with the millennium. All societies have troubles, but I think we can live together much more effectively than we have done in the past. I do think that the racism in this country was practiced unconsciously until about the last half century. I mean, people people otherwise estimable and self-righteous and so on, were not aware of the extent to which they were perpetuating racist habits and laws and everything else. White America has only recently become conscious of its own racism. As it has done so, it has made many changes. Eventually, those changes may reach the point of extirpating the racism inside our souls. And I think that time will come. I also think in the longer run, what's going to defeat the effort of those who try to divide the country up into separate ethnic and racial communities is, look at the rates of intermarriage. Intermarriage across ethnic lines, intermarriage across religious lines, increasingly intermarriage across racial lines. I understand that only 25% of marriages in America today take place between partners of the same ethnic group. So I have confidence in the longer run that sex and love are going to
How's that for a closing? Let me conclude a most stimulating evening that has superbly carried out the goals of the Frank Coffin Lecture on Law and Public Service. Our special thanks to Joanne Amerling, Christy Clifford, Barbara Gauditz of the law school staff for making this evening as smooth and as delightful as possible. Their work over the last year has been superb. Let me close with the words of another historian. When we talk of the American democratic faith, we must understand it in its true dimensions. It is not an impervious, final, complacent orthodoxy, intolerant of deviation and dissent, fulfilled in flag salutes, oaths of allegiance, and hands over the heart. It is an ever-evolving philosophy, fulfilling its ideals through debate, self-criticism, protest, disrespect, and irreverence, a tradition in which all have rights of heterodoxy and opportunities for self-assertion. As well you may guess, its author is to my immediate left. Professor Schlesinger, thank you for a marvelous evening. We will see you next year.
TV4, Extraordinary Television, the Community Television Network.